The year is 1973. The Vietnam War is over, and President Richard Nixon has resigned following the Watergate scandal. The nation is bitterly divided and deeply disillusioned with foreign entanglements. From Vietnam to Korea, Americans are questioning their country's role in the world. And so, with a president mired in scandal, an economy teetering on the brink, and a population weary of global commitments, the United States withdraws further into itself. America pulls out of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It ends most of its remaining foreign aid programs and severely restricts immigration. Turning inward, the United States shuts down much of its diplomatic corps and reduces its embassy presence across the world. Even relations with their NATO allies are down. The United States is effectively done with global affairs. It's now the 1970s, and in this alternate history, the rest is entirely up to the world. In our world, China's economic rise was a gradual process, first surpassing Britain in the mid-19th century to become the world's second-largest economy, then overtaking the Soviet Union in the late Cold War before eventually surpassing the United States in the 2008 Great Recession. But in this timeline, China faces almost no competition. With the US withdrawing into itself, the Soviets have no interest in competing economically with the Chinese, and the Western allies are unequipped or interested in challenging China, so China industrializes quickly and becomes the world's biggest economic power in just a few years. Meanwhile, as we saw in episode 5, Iran is flexing its own newfound military power, driving Israel into a corner. In this world, though with America so deeply entrenched in domestic issues, there's no support for Israel. Saudi Arabia, once a staunch American ally, is now a Chinese partner. Secured by Chinese investment and military technology, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which in our world began in 2013, launches here in the 1970s and connects Asia, Africa and Europe through massive ports, railways and highways. The Middle East and much of Africa are effectively tied to China by the end of the 1970s, and only the countries of Western Europe and North America remain independent. But that independence is fragile. The economies of most Western European nations were deeply intertwined with the United States during the latter half of the 20th century. France, Germany, and the UK were the third, fourth, and fifth largest economies in the world, respectively, by the 1970s. But with the US retreating inward, Western Europe is reduced to just one major power, West Germany. Countries like France and Britain fail to industrialize as they did in our world, and they become heavily reliant on their larger neighbor to the east. The Netherlands and Belgium are tied closely to Germany, while Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland become tightly integrated with the Soviet Union to their east. Only Ireland remains independent, becoming a tax haven for international corporations. As the 1970s come to a close, the Soviet Union is the first to recognize the changing world. The communist world is shattered. The West is preoccupied with its own problems. The Middle East is dominated by a nuclear Iran, and China looms over Asia and Africa. Realizing that a new world order is indeed forming, Brezhnev seeks to strengthen ties with his biggest rival, China. The two communist powers normalize relations in 1974. Split ends and Mao Zedong visits Moscow in 1976. Relations between the two communist giants grow warm as they plan their shared future in a post-American world. But Mao dies before this future can be realized. His death brings Deng Xiaoping to power. Where Mao had focused on ideology, Deng is focused on pragmatics. He realizes that China cannot afford to keep itself isolated, and begins opening China up to foreign investment. State-owned enterprises are created to manage these investments, granting the Chinese government unprecedented control over its economy. By the 1980s, the Chinese economy is booming. It attracts investments from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Western Europe. By the 1990s, China's GDP is almost twice that of the US and Western Europe combined. China has taken the place of the United States as the world's most technologically advanced society, pushing breakthroughs in superconductor technology, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. China also takes the place of the United States as the world's most influential cultural force. Chinese films, music, fashion, and cuisine are the dominant trends of the era. Knowing that their own culture will not be able to compete with China, countries across the world mandate the teaching of Mandarin alongside native languages in schools. By the turn of the century, Mandarin is the world's most spoken language in both native and non-native speakers. There's only one problem with China's model, though. For all its benefits, it's built on compliance and control. There is little tolerance for dissent, and governments that depend on China find themselves increasingly subject to Chinese pressure. When Indonesia nationalizes a Chinese-owned bank in 1998, China responds by ending its preferential trading status, cutting off Indonesian access to lucrative Chinese markets. Soon, the Indonesian government is begging to reintegrate its economy with China. In Kenya, anti-government protests erupt as people blame their reliance on Chinese-built infrastructure and Chinese consumer goods for their dire straits. The Kenyan government cracks down brutally, crushing the rebellion. In Sri Lanka, a debt crisis sparked by Chinese loans threatens to undo years of progress. Despite the chaos, the Sri Lankan government refuses to bend to Chinese pressure and restructure its economy around the Chinese market. And so, China withdraws funding, letting the Sri Lankan economy collapse. Unable to control the fallout, the Sri Lankan government resigns, and Chinese troops occupy the country, turning it into a Chinese protectorate. This pattern continues throughout the Chinese sphere. African nations are forced to accept Chinese soldiers to put down revolts. Anti-Chinese protests in the Philippines are crushed by Chinese proxies, and soon, Beijing has turned the whole of Asia into a client state. Only Iran remains outside of the Chinese sphere, but it too is pressured by Beijing to conform. China pushes its own nuclear agenda on the already volatile nation, promising to help Iran develop its own nuclear weapons program in exchange for concessions in the Persian Gulf. Within 3 decades, China goes from being a regional power to dominating the entire planet. But its victory is costly. Its drive for total control alienates much of the world, and despite its focus on industry, China finds itself lagging behind in things like basic healthcare and education. China's drive for compliance and control hasn't made it any more popular internationally, and with so many nations resentful of Chinese domination, it won't take much to turn the tide against them. Which brings us to our next episode, where we explore a world where the final piece of the post-Cold War world order falls into place. Russia's resurgence under Boris Yeltsin and the collapse of Yugoslavia sparks a new Russian renaissance. To find out how Russia's rise reshapes the world, don't miss episode 7. Check it out when it comes out.